The vegetable that saved entire tribes from starvation was deliberately erased from American agriculture, and most people have never even heard its name. While we obsess over superfoods from distant continents, we've abandoned the most nutrient-dense crops that once thrived in our own soil. What happened to them? Most Americans have never heard of sunchokes, but these knobby little tubers once kept entire communities alive through brutal winters. The colonists called them Jerusalem artichokes, though they're neither from Jerusalem nor related to artichokes. Classic case of terrible marketing, really. These underground gems taste like a cross between potatoes and water chestnuts, with a satisfying nutty sweetness that made them irresistible to early settlers. What made sunchokes absolutely brilliant was their stubborn refusal to give up. Poor soil? No problem. Harsh frost? Bring it on. They thrived where other crops threw in the towel. But here's where it gets interesting. Sunchokes are packed with iron and potassium, nutrients that were life or death important when scurvy and malnutrition stalked frontier families. Native Americans had been cultivating these tubers for centuries, storing them in root cellars where they'd stay fresh all winter long. You could eat them raw for that satisfying crunch, or roast them over a fire until they turned sweet and tender. Raw sunchokes contain resistant starch, which feeds the good bacteria in your gut. Modern nutritionists are just catching up to what indigenous peoples knew all along. The weird part is how completely they vanished from American tables. When potatoes arrived from South America, sunchokes got pushed aside like yesterday's news. Potatoes were easier to cook, stored longer, and frankly, had better PR. Today, most people walk past sunchokes in specialty grocery stores without a second glance. They cost $8 a pound and get labeled as some exotic superfood. Our ancestors would laugh. Then there's another forgotten tuber that required even more specialized knowledge to harvest safely. Most people think of poison when they hear toxic plant, but Native Americans along the eastern coast had a different approach. They saw twahu, also known as arrow arum, and thought, dinner. Sure, it could kill you if eaten raw, but with the right preparation, pure starchy gold. This marsh-dwelling tuber grew where other crops simply couldn't survive. Soggy wetlands, flooded areas, spots that would drown regular vegetables, twahu thrived there like a happy duck. The plant basically laughed at farming challenges that stumped everyone else. Here's the thing about indigenous food knowledge. It wasn't just about finding calories. These folks figured out complex detoxification processes that would make modern chemists jealous. They'd roast the tubers for hours, sometimes leaching them in running water for days. Talk about patience. Try explaining that timeline to someone waiting for their microwave burrito. But wait, there's more. The leaves weren't just decoration. They became nature's aluminum foil, perfect for wrapping fish or other foods before steaming. Zero waste, maximum efficiency. Makes you wonder who the real innovators were. The preparation was labor-intensive, sure, but the payoff was reliable nutrition when you needed it most. Twahu provided steady carbohydrates during lean seasons, growing in places where nothing else would cooperate. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who even recognizes arrow arum, let alone knows how to prepare it safely. Most of this knowledge exists only in dusty historical records and the memories of elders. Speaking of forgotten foods that required serious survival skills, let's head west to the prairies, where another root crop earned the nickname road snack among traveling tribes. Picture a root so tough, it could survive anywhere from bone-dry summer heat to brutal prairie winters. That's the prairie turnip for you, nature's original energy bar. Plains tribes called it tipsala, and honestly, they had it figured out. This protein-packed root wasn't just food, it was portable survival. Think about it. You're heading out on a 3-week buffalo hunt across endless grassland. What do you pack? Prairie turnip, dried and ready to go. The timing was everything. Summer digging meant back-breaking work under the scorching sun, but the payoff was huge. Women would harvest these thumb-sized roots, then slice them thin as paper. Once dried, they turned hard as rocks and could last for years. Years! Your modern granola bars wish they were that reliable. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just trail mix. Ground into flour, prairie turnip became the backbone of winter meals. The nutrition was incredible too. Fiber, vitamin C, manganese, everything you needed when fresh food was just a memory. What made this root special was its stubborn streak. While other crops threw in the towel during droughts, Prairie turnip just shrugged and kept growing. The drier the better, actually. Then came the plows. Mile after mile of prairie got turned over for corn and wheat. Cattle grazed what was left into dust. The prairie turnip, which had fed entire civilizations, suddenly had nowhere to grow. Today, you'd be lucky to spot one in the wild. Makes you wonder what we traded away for convenience, right? Well, speaking of forgotten proteins that once fed whole communities, there's another root that takes things to an entirely different level. The groundnut might sound like something you'd find in a trail mix, but this climbing vine produced tubers that could put a potato to shame. Native tribes called it the Indian potato, though that name barely scratches the surface of what made this plant special. Here's where things get interesting. While regular potatoes give you mostly starch and a pat on the back, groundnuts pack triple the protein. Triple! That's more protein per bite than most people get from their expensive quinoa bowls today. The vine itself was pretty clever too. It didn't need prime farmland or perfect soil conditions. Nope. It thrived along stream banks and forest edges, climbing up trees and shrubs like it owned the place. You could find these tubers growing in spots where other crops would throw in the towel. But the real genius was in how people used them. The tubers could be boiled until tender, roasted over coals for a nutty flavor, or mashed up and added to stews for extra substance. Think of it as the original protein powder, except it actually tasted good and didn't cost $40 a container. So why did we ditch this nutritional powerhouse? Well, potatoes showed up and played the convenience card. They cooked faster, stored easier, and didn't require you to go hunting along creek beds. Sometimes the lazy option wins, even when it's not the better option. The groundnut quietly faded from American tables, taking its protein-packed secret with it. Makes you wonder what other nutritional treasures we traded away for convenience. Speaking of forgotten greens, there's another plant that makes modern spinach look like amateur hour. You know those annoying weeds taking over your garden? Well, joke's on us. What we call lamb squirters today used to feed entire civilizations. This leafy green powerhouse makes modern spinach look like a weakling. We're talking about a plant packed with more calcium than milk and enough vitamin A to make carrots jealous. Native Americans didn't just stumble across it, they actively cultivated specific varieties for thousands of years. Here's the brilliant part. Lamb squirters thrives exactly where you don't want it. Disturbed soil, perfect. Terrible drainage, no problem. Your grandmother's compost pile, it's basically a 5-star restaurant for this stuff. But the real genius wasn't just eating the leaves fresh in spring. Indigenous communities figured out how to dry these greens for winter storage, creating nutritional insurance when snow covered everything else. The seeds? Ground them up, and you've got protein-packed flour that could stretch through the hungry months. And here's where it gets really clever. The whole plant was basically a grocery store. Young leaves went into soups, mature leaves got cooked like spinach, seeds became bread flour. Even the stems were edible when young and tender. The irony is painful, right? We spend fortunes on superfood powders while pulling up one of nature's most complete foods and tossing it in the trash. Lamb squirters literally grows for free in most backyards, requires zero maintenance, and delivers nutrition that would make a dietitian weep with joy. Today's farmers spray millions of dollars worth of herbicides to kill what once kept people alive and healthy. Makes you wonder what other weeds we're missing. Speaking of plants we completely misunderstood, wait until you hear about a root that could cure what ails you. When you think about ancient pharmacy meets dinner table, Indian celery was basically the original 2-for-1 deal. This wasn't your typical grocery store celery, though. We're talking about a wild carrot family root that could feed you and fix you up at the same time. Native communities across the western regions knew exactly what they had here. The roots got pulled from the ground and eaten straight up, raw and crunchy. Or they'd toss them over a fire for roasting, which brought out this deep, earthy flavor that made regular vegetables seem boring by comparison. But here's where it gets interesting. The young leaves and stems weren't just garnish. People would simmer them down into greens that packed serious nutrition. Think of it as nature's multivitamin, growing wild without any help from humans. The medicinal side, well, that's where things got really clever. When someone in the community was fighting off a chest cold or dealing with breathing trouble, out came the Indian celery roots. They'd prepare them specially for respiratory relief. Got a nasty wound that wouldn't heal? Same plant, different preparation method. Makes sense, right? Why grow 10 different plants when one could handle multiple jobs? The problem started when people got a little too enthusiastic about harvesting. Wild populations began shrinking as more folks discovered how useful this stuff really was. Then land development came along and wiped out huge patches of the natural habitat where Indian celery thrived. Today, finding wild Indian celery takes some serious detective work. But speaking of plants that require detective work to eat safely, there's another forgotten green that was worth the risk. Spring arrived in colonial America like a cruel joke. Families had survived another brutal winter on stored corn and whatever scraps they could find, and then Mother Nature dangled salvation right in front of them. Problem was that salvation could kill you if you messed it up. Enter pokeweed, or as folks called it back then, poke salad. This stuff grew everywhere in the eastern woodlands, shooting up tall purple stems that screamed, "Eat me," to desperate families. But here's where it gets interesting and dangerous. Young pokeweed shoots were absolutely loaded with vitamins A and C, plus trace minerals that winter-weary bodies craved. Think of it as nature's multivitamin, but with a deadly catch. The mature plant? Pure poison. Roots, berries, older leaves, all toxic enough to put you in the ground. So how did people not die left and right? Cultural knowledge passed down like family recipes. Grandmothers taught daughters exactly which shoots to pick, when to pick them, and most importantly, how to cook them properly. You had to boil those young greens not once, but twice, dumping the water each time to leach out the toxins. The whole ritual became a rite of spring. Families would venture into the woods together, hunting for those tender purple shoots poking through the forest floor. Kids learned to spot the safe ones, while adults shared stories about Cousin Jimmy who got careless with poke and spent 3 days wishing he hadn't. This wasn't just about getting fed. It was about survival knowledge encoded in tradition. Makes you wonder what other secrets were hiding in those family recipes, doesn't it? Speaking of hidden treasures, wait until you hear about what early Americans discovered growing wild in their sunny meadows. Wild sunflowers used to tower over meadows like nature's own skyscrapers, but here's the kicker. Nobody was eating the seeds back then. Nope. The real treasure was hiding in plain sight. Those thick green stems and plump flower buds. Before anyone figured out how to breed sunflowers for those massive seed heads we know today, Native Americans were munching on something completely different. They'd harvest the tender shoots in spring and early summer, plus grab those unopened flower buds right before they bloomed. The taste? Well, imagine crossing asparagus with artichoke hearts. Sounds fancy, right? These sunflower chokes had this sweet, nutty flavor that made them worth the effort. And trust me, anything that tastes like artichoke without the Mediterranean price tag is a win. The preparation was dead simple too. Roast them over coals or steam them in earth ovens. No complicated processing, no toxic compounds to worry about, just good old-fashioned cooking. The stems stayed tender if you caught them young enough, and those flower buds were like little green treasures packed with vitamins. But here's where things get interesting. These wild varieties thrived everywhere. Sunny meadows, disturbed soil, even poor ground where other crops threw in the towel. Zero maintenance required. They basically grew themselves. Then agriculture got smarter. Plant breeders started focusing on bigger seeds, better oil content, massive flower heads. Makes sense for commercial farming, sure, but we completely forgot about eating the rest of the plant. Now, most gardeners just stare at their sunflower stalks and wonder what to do with all that green bulk. Meanwhile, there's another forgotten crop that's been quietly making a comeback in health food circles. Want to know what fueled ancient warriors and marathon runners? Amaranth. This tiny grain packs more protein than most cereals and enough calcium to make your bones sing. The Aztecs called it never-fading flour. And honestly, they weren't exaggerating. Picture a plant that laughs in the face of drought. While corn withers and wheat throws in the towel, Amaranth keeps cranking out those nutty little seeds like it's having the time of its life. Poor soil? No problem. Blazing sun? Bring it on. This stuff grows where other crops go to die. But here's the kicker. You can eat the whole darn plant. Young leaves taste like spinach's cooler cousin, loaded with iron that'll put Popeye to shame. The seeds, pure gold. Grind them into flour, pop them like tiny popcorn, or toss them in soups for that satisfying crunch. Native Americans knew what they had. They'd harvest those gorgeous red and gold seed heads in late summer, storing enough protein-packed grains to last through winter. Smart move considering amaranth contains all 9 essential amino acids. Makes sense, right? Then came the great grain takeover. Wheat muscled its way onto every dinner plate, and amaranth got shoved into the health food store curiosity corner. What a shame. We traded a drought-resistant superfood for crops that need babying. The funny thing? Now fancy restaurants charge $15 for amaranth bowls, calling them ancient grains. Well, at least someone figured out we threw away something pretty spectacular. Speaking of spectacular plants that got the cold shoulder, there's this grass that produces grains so nutrient-dense, entire civilizations built their lives around it. Picture this. You're gliding through northern Minnesota in a birch bark canoe, surrounded by tall grass swaying in shallow water. That grass? It's wild rice, and it's about to change everything you thought you knew about American grains. Wild rice isn't actually rice at all. It's a grass that grows chest-high in pristine lakes across the Great Lakes region. The Ojibwe called it manumin, meaning good berry, and for good reason. These dark, nutty grains packed more protein than corn, wheat, or actual rice. Plus, they delivered serious amounts of fiber, B vitamins, and minerals that kept entire communities thriving through brutal winters. But here's where it gets interesting. You couldn't just walk into a field and harvest this stuff. Wild rice demanded a whole production. Families would paddle out in canoes during late summer, bend the tall grass over their boats, and gently knock the seeds loose with wooden sticks. Takes skill, patience, and pristine water conditions. And that's the kicker. Wild rice is basically the diva of grains. It only grows in clean, shallow lakes with just the right water levels. Too much pollution? Gone. Drain the wetlands for farmland? History. Dam a river and change the water flow? You've just wiped out generations of food security. The decline hit hard when European settlers arrived with their drainage projects and industrial farming. Suddenly, thousands of acres of wetlands disappeared. The rice beds that had fed communities for centuries vanished almost overnight. Today, true wild rice costs a fortune at health food stores, if you can find it at all. Most wild rice is actually cultivated in paddies, missing that complex nutty flavor of the real deal. Speaking of forgotten flavors, wait until you hear about a fruit that tastes like tropical vacation but grows right in your backyard. Down in the southeastern United States, there's a vine that produces what might be the most exotic-tasting native fruit you've never heard of. The maypop looks like something you'd expect to find in a tropical rainforest, not growing wild along Alabama fence lines. This climbing passionflower vine cranked out purple and white blooms that would make any garden center jealous. But the real treasure came later in the season. The fruits, about the size of chicken eggs, packed a flavor punch that early settlers described as tropical paradise in your backyard. Here's the kicker, though. Each maypop contained more vitamin C than most citrus fruits. The pulp tasted like a cross between a banana and a pineapple, with just enough tartness to keep things interesting. Native communities didn't just eat the fruit either. They brewed the leaves into calming teas and used the flowers for everything from headaches to anxiety. The vine itself was practically indestructible. Drought? No problem. Poor soil? Even better. It spread along forest edges and abandoned farmland like nature's own grocery delivery system. One plant could produce dozens of fruits each season, and the roots came back year after year. But here's where things get frustrating. As exotic imports flooded American markets, people forgot about their backyard treasure. Why bother with maypops when you could buy pineapples from Hawaii? The real tragedy isn't just losing a delicious fruit. We lost knowledge about how to use every part of the plant for food and medicine. Speaking of lost plant knowledge, wait until you hear about the only native North American plant that could give your morning coffee a run for its money. Here's the thing about caffeine. Americans will do almost anything to get their daily fix. Coffee shops on every corner, energy drinks that could power a small town, and tea imports that cost more than some people's rent. But what if I told you that before all this madness, Native Americans had their own perfectly good caffeine source growing right in their backyards? Meet Yaupon holly, the only plant native to North America that naturally contains caffeine. While Europeans were sailing halfway around the world and starting wars over tea leaves, indigenous communities in the Southeast had been brewing this stuff for centuries. The leaves pack a caffeinated punch without the jittery crash that makes your afternoon feel like a train wreck. Southeastern tribes would roast the leaves until they turned dark, then brew them into what they called the black drink. This wasn't your casual morning cup of joe, though. It played a starring role in purification ceremonies and important tribal gatherings. But here's where it gets interesting. Yaupon holly is practically indestructible. Drought? No problem. Sandy soil that kills everything else? Perfect. Hurricanes? It just keeps on growing. The plant basically laughs at whatever nature throws at it. Then colonization happened, and somehow Americans decided that shipping tea from thousands of miles away made more sense than using the caffeine-loaded bush in their own backyard. Makes perfect sense, right? The crazy part is that Yaupon still grows wild across the southeast, waiting for someone to remember what it's good for. While we're spending fortunes on imported energy, the solution is literally growing as a weed in half the country. Speaking of forgotten fruits that grow wild in American backyards, there's one that tastes like tropical vacation, but most people walk right past it every day. Walk through any American forest in late summer, and you might catch a whiff of something that smells suspiciously like banana bread. Follow your nose and you'll find pawpaw trees drooping with softball-sized green fruits that taste like nature's version of banana custard mixed with mango. These weren't some exotic import. Pawpaws are America's largest native fruit, and they used to feed entire communities from Georgia to Michigan. Indigenous tribes planned their late summer gatherings around pawpaw harvests, and early settlers called them poor man's banana, though honestly, they taste better than most bananas you'll find at the grocery store today. Here's the kicker. Pawpaws pack more vitamin C than oranges, plus loads of magnesium and potassium. One fruit delivers about a third of your daily vitamin C needs. Not bad for something that grows wild in shady river bottoms where other fruit trees throw in the towel. But pawpaws are picky little divas. They ripen for maybe 2 weeks in September, then they're done. The fruit turns to mush within days of picking, making them impossible to ship. Try to store them longer than a weekend and you've got expensive compost. That fussy shelf life killed their commercial future. Why mess with temperamental pawpaws when you can grow apples that last months in storage? Modern agriculture wanted predictable, shippable fruit, not something that demanded you eat it right now or lose it forever. Then there's habitat loss. Pawpaws love those rich, moist bottomlands that we've spent 2 centuries draining and developing. The trees that do survive often get mowed down as underbrush. Well, speaking of plants with timing issues, let's talk about another forgotten fruit that had its own storage problems. Ever find yourself at a farmer's market staring at those overpriced tomatillos and thinking there has to be a better way? Well, your ancestors had it figured out centuries ago. Ground cherries grew wild across America like nature's own candy shop. These golden gems came wrapped in their own paper lantern husks, making them the original grab-and-go snack. No plastic packaging required. The taste? Think sweet meets tart with a hint of pineapple. Vitamin C levels that would make an orange jealous. And here's the kicker. They thrived in terrible soil that would send modern crops running for the hills. Native communities knew exactly when to harvest these little treasures. Late summer brought bushes loaded with fruit, each one protected by its papery husk like a natural gift wrap. Kids could wander through patches, popping them like candy. Adults got more creative. They'd dry ground cherries for winter storage, turning them into leather-like strips. Others made sauces that lasted months. Some even fermented them into drinks that packed more punch than your average happy hour special. But here's where things get frustrating. Modern agriculture took one look at ground cherries and said, nah. Why? Shelf life. These beauties don't sit pretty in grocery stores for weeks like their industrial cousins. They demand to be eaten fresh or preserved quickly. So we traded flavor and nutrition for convenience. Smart move, right? Ground cherries laughed at droughts that killed other crops. They produced food in soil so poor it looked like a construction site. Yet somehow we decided they weren't worth the trouble. Speaking of plants that thrived where others failed, there's another forgotten food that made winter survival possible across eastern forests. Spring hunger was real back then. Winter food stores running low, nothing growing yet, and your stomach growling like an angry bear. But if you knew where to look in the eastern woodlands, tiny treasures waited just beneath the forest floor. Indian potato wasn't actually a potato at all. These marble-sized corms from the spring beauty plant packed more punch per bite than you'd expect. Sweet, crispy, loaded with vitamin C right when scurvy threatened to knock you flat. Indigenous communities knew exactly when to dig. Too early and they're bitter, too late and they're woody. The crazy part? They grew everywhere. Moist woodlands from Canada down to Georgia, carpeting the forest floor with delicate white flowers. You could eat them raw like tiny radishes or toss them in the fire for a few minutes. Either way, they delivered that first fresh bite of spring when everything else still looked dead. Here's where it gets interesting. These little corms don't store worth a darn, so you ate them fresh or not at all. No preserving, no drying, no saving for later, pure seasonal eating at its finest. Kids learned to spot the heart-shaped leaves and delicate blooms, turning foraging into a family treasure hunt. Most folks today walk right past them in their own backyards. Spring beauties still pop up every year, but we're too busy rushing to the grocery store to notice. We've labeled them weeds, yard clutter, to mow down without a second thought. But there's another forgotten grain that once fed entire prairie communities, and its story might surprise you even more. Here's the thing about little barley. It saved entire communities before anyone had ever heard of Wonder Bread. This scrappy wild grain grew knee-high across Midwestern prairies, looking nothing like the fancy barley in your beer. But don't let its size fool you. Native peoples figured out something clever. Plant this stuff in late fall, and by early summer, you'd have grain when everyone else was still waiting for corn to ripen. Talk about perfect timing. While other crops were barely sprouting, little barley was already filling stomachs and grinding into flour. The grains themselves packed serious nutrition. Fiber that would make your grandmother's bran muffins jealous, plus selenium, a mineral most people today don't even know they need. Ground into porridge or baked into flatbread, it tasted nutty and filling. Not gourmet, maybe, but reliable as sunrise. Then there's the genius part. Little barley thrived where bigger grains struggled. Dry spells? No problem. Poor soil? Even better. It actually preferred the tough conditions that would kill pampered crops. Makes sense when you think about prairie life. You needed food that could handle whatever nature threw at it. But here's where the story gets frustrating. When European wheat and modern barley varieties swept across America, little barley got pushed aside like yesterday's newspaper. Farmers wanted bigger yields, faster harvests, crops that looked impressive in the field. Now this ancient grain survives mostly in forgotten corners of prairies, still growing wild while we import barley from halfway around the world. Sometimes the old ways knew something we forgot. And speaking of forgotten wisdom, wait until you hear what else we've lost along the way.